Welcome back to Switzer on Australia's Business Channel. With the budget handed down and much made of super changes ahead of it, what were the changes to super and how will it affect you? To sum up the super news out of the budget, we have Paul Rickard from the Switzer Super Report, former boss of Comsec, stockbroker of the year or decade or century. Welcome, Paul Rickard.
Thank you, Peter. Just keep rolling there. I like that.
Okay, that's good, mate. Were there any surprises for you?
Look, very hard to concentrate last night when I saw the budget, but no surprises. Look, the only thing, in terms of super, we'll go through it in a moment, Peter, but really no changes there apart from reconfirming what had previously been announced on the 5th of April. The only surprise was essentially killing off, not a super-related change, but more a personal investment, was killing off the rebate on the net medical expenses. They sort of killed that off in last year's budget, and this year they've basically brought it to an end. You've got 2 more years to do it. So if you've got to have medical expenses above $5,000, and then you only get a 10% rebate. So if you don't make a claim in 2012-13, you won't be eligible in the next 2 years. So that's coming to an end. That's a bit of a sad story, but that's the only thing that was new from my point of view.
Okay, so let's go through the things that will affect people in 2013-14. I guess the first one is super contributions. What's happening there?
Well, that's the obvious one, Peter. That's the start of going from 9% to 12%. So for employers, in terms of your remuneration, the minimum amount goes up from 9% to 9.25%. That applies from the 1st of July. It'll go up to 9.5% the following year and all the way up to 12% by 2019-2020. So something to look forward to.
Okay. Now, for people at home who run a business and employ people, they might be asking the question and hating what they think the answer is. Who's going to pay this 0.25%? Out of whose bank account does this money come from?
Well, for most people, Peter, it's actually going to be the employer. I know that there are some employers who've got type of agreements with their employees such that they talk about total cost or total employment cost, and the employee might actually see a very tiny reduction in their real wages. But I'm guessing in most cases, 95% of occasions, it's going to be the employer paying the 0.25%. Probably not going to get too worried about it the next couple of years, but that's going to start to increment by 0.5% within a couple of years and start to become quite material.
Yep, okay, so that's a little bit of a business negative for those people employing people. High concessional contributions cap, what's happening there?
So this was announced back on the 5th of April. That legislation is currently through in the Parliament at the moment, and that's the one positive that came out of that 5th of April announcement when we had, I think was brought on a bit earlier than they anticipated because of all the noise about superannuation. So for those over 60, come the 1st of July, the concessional contributions cap, that's the amount of money your employer puts in through the 9.25%, plus any salary sacrifice components you make, or if you're self-employed, any amount you claim as a tax deduction. That increases from $25,000 to $35,000, and that takes effect from the start of next financial year. And then they're also legislating for those who are aged over 50. It'll go from $25,000 to $35,000 at the start of the 2014 year. So that's probably the one sort of real positive change. Anyone over 60, you can put an extra $10,000 into superannuation.
Okay, so what about the relief for excess concessional contributions? Explain that to the audience.
Well, this is the old sort of Bill Shorten excuse, I think. The dog ate my homework. They've actually made it a little bit easier. So if you made a mistake in terms of you made too many concessional contributions, it was a pretty punitive tax regime. You effectively got taxed at 31.5% on the excess. Now there was a bit of a sort of a $10,000 once-off sort of forgiveness, but it's quite easy to do, particularly those who've got multiple employers. So from the start of this year, that's the 1st of July, if you have excess contributions, what will actually happen is that the fund will give them back to you. So that's the amount for most people over the $25,000. The fund will give you the money back, and you'll then be taxed at your marginal tax rate, or the difference between that and your marginal tax rate. So effectively, if you're currently paying 46.5% tax, you'll pay 46.5%. If you're only paying 32%, you'll pay a much lower rate. So basically that's a bit fairer, it's a better system, and that'll kick in from the 1st of July as well.
And no one will get slugged 93%, which could happen under the old regime, right?
Well, it's still possible, Peter, if you actually have excess contributions, both concessional and non-concessional. So it's still possible to end up actually paying 93%. That doesn't change, but for most people, that's very unlikely.
So the people who put those really big non-concessional contributions, they're the ones who have to be very careful about what's happened in the concessional area.
They still have to be, be very careful. And if you have many employers, and I know that if you're a private contractor and you're a company director and you're on boards or whatever it is, and all sorts of people are paying superannuation, you've still got to monitor this concessional component very carefully. So just be cognizant of that.
Okay. Minimum pension payments. What's going on there, Paul?
So this is for those who are taking a pension and really anyone over 55 in superannuation, particularly running your own fund. You're probably taking a transition to retirement pension, or if not, you should be asking a question why you're not. Well, post the GFC, as a result of the GFC, the government allowed pensioners to actually take out less from their super account because of the impact of equities markets at the time. We were all allowed to take out less to comply with the law. So that those concessions are finally ending. So from the start of next financial year, we go back to the normal amount that you have to take as a minimum. So if you have, for example, you're aged 62 and you've got a transitional retirement pension of say $100,000, then the minimum is 4%. You've got to take out $4,000 at least as a pension during the year. And all those factors go back up to the normal levels. So just be careful about it as well.
Okay, now this is the one for typical Labor voters. If you've got income over $300,000, you're going to be slugged.
Well, that's right, Peter, and this is actually currently before the Parliament, and there's probably been, I think, a bit of a development on this today, but the plan is actually, and this actually doesn't apply from next year, it actually applies, it's already effectively applied from the start of this financial year. That's the 1st of July 2012. They just never got around to legislating because it's actually a pretty hard thing to implement. But finally, we've got legislation in the Parliament at the moment that applies a higher rate of tax for concessional contributions if your income is over $300,000. Now, $300,000 is not a simple amount because it's not just your taxable income. You've got to do all sorts of things. You've got to add back in any fringe benefits tax. You've got to add back in things like any net investment losses, such as a rental property. You have to add back in reportable super contributions. So it's actually going to catch a lot more people out than the so-called number of $300,000.
Yep.
And the impact...
And Paul, so in simple terms, if someone maybe was on a high income, but they might have, say, 3 or 4 rental properties, and they've got big sort of tax losses, which brings their taxable income down, you have to add those losses back on, don't you? And you will be slugged, is it 30% on the contribution?
So that's right, Peter. You have to add back any investment losses, and you'll end up paying 30% tax on those concessional contributions. Now, where it's a bit difficult is the fund's going to pay some. The fund's going to pay the 15% when it goes into the fund, and then somehow the tax office is then going to come in to you individually and ask you to pay a bit like a surcharge to the other 15%. And that's why the legislation is taken so long, because it's actually very hard to draft. Now, it actually applies from the 1st of July in 2012, so it's actually, this is sort of almost retrospective legislation. And we're actually, I think today there was some development that might possibly, I think the coalition might have changed its position on this piece of legislation.
But Paul, also when you think this through, some people could get a big back tax bill, couldn't they?
Well, that's right. I mean, when you're not going to know your income, or you're not going to be able to tell the tax officer income till the following tax year. I think quite a few people will be surprised when they get an assessment sometime in the middle or towards the end of, the first part of calendar 2014, that they suddenly are going to have to pay some tax on some superannuation contributions they made over 12 or 18 months ago.
Yeah. Okay, let's just have a quickly before we're out of time. What should people do before the end of the financial year, given these changes?
Okay, well, the two obvious things, of course, use up your caps. So everyone is $25,000 for concessional caps. For most people, it will still make sense to make sure you make the contribution up to $25,000. The non-concessional, Peter, which is your own money, you can potentially, if you're working, put up to $150,000 in that. Two other things that are worth thinking about very quickly. One is the co-contribution. If you have a low-income spouse or an adult child who might be doing a little bit of work, the co-contribution of up to $500 still exists. I know I'll be making a co-contribution on behalf of my 2 adult children into my self-managed superannuation fund as a very generous parent.
You're a great dad.
I'm a great dad, aren't I?
What a great father. Imagine your daughters when they go out on Friday night and say, yeah, my dad pumped up my super for me. What a dad.
Yeah, what a dad. So that $500 still exists. So think about that. They do have to have a bit of employment work, so there are a couple of catches there, and there's also an income test. And lastly, Peter, if we've got time, if you are running your own fund and you want to get some money into it and you've got assets outside superannuation, there's still likely to be some changes around what we call the in-specie transfers. That's in terms of bringing assets into superannuation. Now, the government made this announcement over 12 months ago. It deferred it. It could still be a little bit hard to bring shares into superannuation post the 1st of July. So my advice to people is, if you are thinking of making what we call a non-concessional contribution, and it's coming from your own money through listed shares, subject to any capital gains tax issues, you may want to get it done prior to the 30th of June.
Big issue, Paul. And, so thanks for that, mate. And as I always say, you are the super dad of Australia.
I'm a fantastic dad, aren't I, Pete? I'll take that home with me.
Okay, mate. See you later. That's Paul Rickard from the Switzer Super Report, and a lot of that stuff will be covered in the report.